members of the House and Senate are gathering in what is there, and there is the Speaker Mike Johnson and Vice President Kamala Harris. It's obviously a bipartisan or even nonpartisan event where the leaders of this country come together to count the electoral votes. There's Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, who was one of the main individuals who helped cause what happened 4 years ago by putting forward the falsehood that the vice president could somehow do something to stop the electoral count. There's Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries with Catherine Clark, his number two. What are your thoughts as you watch this in action, Caitlin?
Ted Cruz obviously was the first senator to object. And obviously, just looking back on this, what the vice president maintained at the time, as Mark knows well, is that he did not have the power to block the certification on this day 4 years ago.
And he didn't.
What we have seen is the Electoral Count Act that was passed reaffirming that interpretation of the law. So people like John Eastman, who Pence later referred to as a crackpot of attorneys that Trump was listening to at the time, could not make that argument. But also it changed the threshold for how many people have to object to lead to that moment. So even if we were in the exact same situation as 4 years ago, had this law been passed, the threshold would have had to have been much higher than what it was 4 years ago for that to actually happen.
Let's listen in. Vice President Harris is calling for order.
Pursuant to the Constitution and laws of the United States, the Senate and House of Representatives are meeting in joint session to verify the certificates and count the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President of the United States. After ascertainment has been had that the certificates are authentic and correct in form, the tellers will count and make a list of the votes cast by the electors of the several states. The tellers on the part of the two houses will take their places at the clerk's desk.
I just think it's so important to reflect on what we are seeing right now. We talked at the beginning about this complex being fortified, but it's being fortified despite the fact that this is peaceful.
Without objection, the tellers will dispense with reading formal portions of the certificates. After ascertaining that the certificates are regular in form and authentic, the tellers will announce the votes cast by the electors for each state, beginning with Alabama.
Madam President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Alabama seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida received 9 votes for president, and J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio received 9 votes for vice president. Madam President, the certificate of the electoral
Basically what's happening right now, the tellers alternate reporting on the authenticity and the proper form of each of the certificates and the number of votes designated for president and vice president, and then each teller records the results on a paper tally sheet. And then at the end of that, reading all results from all 50 states and D.C., the tellers then compare the results on their 4 tally sheets and all sign all 4 tally sheets. Then the vice president announces the result totals and announces the election of president and vice president. So they are going to be reading through each 50 state and the District of Columbia.
Madam President,
results from Ohio there, obviously the state for J.D. Vance. Back with the team here in New York as we continue to watch what is going on to the counting of the ballot from each of the states. Congressman, you were there 4 years ago. Is it odd watching this?
It is. Well, the funny thing is, we were kind of talking offline here. I was present for 12, 16, and then 20, obviously that thing. And usually, this is a non-event. I mean, I would go, kind of show up, they'd open the session, half the time I'd go back to my office because you don't even need to be on the floor. And this is over in an hour. And that's how it should be. This is great that it's happening this way. But for me, it's surreal because my attention on what January 6th is obviously has been colored by what January 6th was 4 years ago, that I forgot how quick this actually happens and how really perfunctory it actually is. So this is a good thing today. Again, the new incoming president will make the decision whether he wants to move on from January 6th or not. I'm fine whatever he decides. I think the country would be better off if he did. But yeah, it's good to see this happen today.
Do you think January 6th, I mean, years from now, is a date that will live in infamy, to use the phrase used for other events? I'm not comparing it at all to
I think we live in split-screen America. I think for some of the country it will, and it'll be remembered. I think otherwise it'll fall to the history books. And the reality is this. Most of the country did care. It rubbed them the wrong way. They didn't like it. That showed up consistently in polling. But it just didn't rank in the top issues at the end of the day. And I think this was such a historic and wild election cycle, and so many other dynamics entered the last 4 years that in many ways the events of January 6th were eclipsed. And there's a certain privilege involved. I acknowledge it with myself in being able to say, well, I'm a voter against January 6th. I'm voting this way because that day crossed the boundaries for me. But if you feel like the cost of living is too high, the border hasn't been secure, groceries cost too much, and you think that a different candidate, you think Donald Trump's better on that, then that's who you're going to vote for. And we saw that. I mean, we were all covered, the Republican National Committee. That was the direction this was all going. Then Joe Biden gets out of the race and opens up a complete new dynamic. But it will honestly end up being, for many people, a footnote in the history book.
The state of the vote for the President of the United States, as delivered to the President of the Senate, is as follows. The whole number of the electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, the majority is 270. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 312 votes. Kamala D. Harris Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. J.D. Vance of the state of Ohio has received 312 votes. Tim Walz of the state of Minnesota has received 226 votes. This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected, President and Vice President of the United States, each for a term beginning on the 20th day of January 2025, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the House and the Senate. Thank you very much.
All right, there it is, the final gavel coming down there, and Donald Trump has secured 312 electoral votes to Vice President Harris's 226. When she announced the winner, the Republicans stood up and gave a standing ovation for the victor, Donald J. Trump.
Of the judgment having been concluded, pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution Number 2, the 119th Congress, the chair declares this joint session dissolved. Thank you.
The joint session has been dissolved. A lot of grace there by the vice president. That cannot be an easy thing to do. You put decades into a political career and you get an opportunity to run for president. Obviously, the circumstances were what they were. Obviously, her campaign was what it was. But you have to stand there in front of the world and smile and pretend as though no big deal, no big deal.
Glad it's over. I mean, she maintained her cool throughout the whole thing. There's a phrase we heard over and over again: regular, inform, and authentic, as each state was called. And it just struck me because today was normal. It was the opposite of 4 years ago.
Now the governing challenge, 2 weeks, the governing challenge begins for Donald Trump. And already today you're seeing the huge opportunity and the huge risks and challenges he will face as president. A very, very narrow majority in the House, tiny majority in the House, and a very narrow majority in the Senate, and not 60 votes. You know, you always talk about, do you need 60 votes to get much done? They're going to have 53. That's good, but it's not enough. And so even today, he's trying to figure out, how do you do immigration? How do you do tax cuts? How do you do spending cuts? How do you do so many other things he wants to do? So today is a day, as Jamie said, normal. Americans, no matter how you voted, we should celebrate that this January 6th looks nothing like the horrendous day 4 years ago. And now we move on to governing.